Hello people, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this panel. It's my greatest pleasure to welcome you here to discuss the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. An information that surprised the world, surprised everyone who was thinking on the Europe as a constantly growing process, constantly growing trend. Well, this is a panel promoted by IBS Americas here at this auditorium, and we are webcasting it to our students around the world. The objective of this talk is to think about the future. We are not thinking about what happened, but we are thinking about what is going to happen from now on. Not only the future of the United Kingdom itself, we are thinking of the future of the international relations among countries and thinking of the global business too. For this panel, we invited several students from basically all over the world. We are being followed by students from Brazil, República Dominicana, Guatemala, Mexico, Chile, Santo Domingo, Honduras, Ecuador, Peru, Saudi Arabia. We have students enrolled in this webinar from Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, Philippines, Argentina, El Salvador. Well, this is a very long list, and I'm very pleased to have you with us today. And we also have in this auditorium the group of students that are attending the program Strategy and Marketing for Emerging Countries, and also the program Brazilian Portuguese and Business Etiquette holds here in Brazil by IBS. And of course, for this panel, our special guests are two British professors from the Pearson College of London. First, let me introduce you to Professor Will Holt. Will Holt, he is head of Pearson Business School, and please, a round of applause for him, please. Professor Will Holt got his master's degree in business from the University of Birmingham and also from Montpellier Business School. Then we have today with us also Professor Ben Hughes. Please put your hands together for Professor. Professor Ben Hughes is the Vice Principal of Pearson Business School London and got his master's degree in business in education from the University of London. Thank you, professors, for joining us. We will have an initial presentation by our colleagues and then our Q&A session, our question and answer session. We start with the questions emailed with anticipation by you students that are following this presentation through our YouTube channel. And then we will open to the questions of the people present in this auditorium. So let's get started. Last June 24, the British people voted to exit the European Union. It was a majority in the country. Majority means 50% plus one, right? Although London area and Scotland, just to give you a couple of examples, have voted in favor to remain. To be more specific, 48.1% of the voters asked to stay, while 51.9% voted to exit, showing how controversial and how difficult is this matter, how difficult is divided is the country now. In London City, where the Pearson College is located, just to give you an example, 75% of the population of London City voted to stay. Not everyone, right? Well, once the smoke is clearing, what we have to see? First of all, let's not forget that UK is not declaring war against European Union, right? So far. And the UK, as a matter of fact, will remain in the European Union for several years. The exit will be a long process. It will take probably about 5 to 7 years to be completed. But the important thing is that there are many different ways to seek for economic and political integration. Certainly the UK will find its way to be integrated with the European Union and with the rest of the world. But now we have to think of the impacts in the short run and in the long run of this decision. In the short run, as you all may know, this decision is shaking the UK economy. Research shows that the UK business people, they are believing that the economy will be falling down sharply after the aftermath of the vote to leave the European Union. The share of business that reported feeling pessimistic about the UK economy doubled in the week after the Brexit vote. The numbers jumped from 25% of businessmen in the UK who believed that the economy was in a bad mood. From 25%, it went to 49% feeling pessimistic about the future of the UK economy, according to the Center for Economics and Business Research. And also, worldwide impressions are not that good, unfortunately. Economists from Goldman Sachs, for instance, experts in global business, expect an investment-led recession in UK and fall in business investments. Following this bad mood, the sterling pound, the currency of UK, is getting weaker, while some analysts predict it can go very well below dollar within the next few months. Of course, a weak currency is not essentially bad news. It helps exportation, it helps international investments in the UK, but of course it reflects how badly the world is seeing UK now, and it will affect the foreign direct investments of UK companies around the world. It will make it difficult for them. On the political side of this story, we gotta ask ourselves what is gonna happen to the current model of global integration. Since the end of the Second World War, the international community was looking for more integration, more international institutions, and somehow less national sovereignty. It was an answer to the world that faced two world wars. The last World War, the Second World War, killed 50 million people, to give us a lesson of how important it is to integrate countries around the world, how to get the international community close to each other. Now it seems that we need to look for other ways to promote political and economic integrations, ways that attend the expectations of the major corporations and also the expectations of common people. This disconnection between the desires of the country's elite and the majority of the population is the most important message the referendum left us. Now I would like to invite Professors Ben and Will to share their thoughts with us. To fuel the discussion, I'd like to ask you a provocative question. You run a business school over there, right? You are teaching people how to do business in England. What now? What is going to change in the way they should be teaching, if they should be dealing with companies over there? And of course, what is going to change in your way to run your business school, professors? Please, another round of applause to thank you.
So first of all, thank you for having us here, and thank you for being here on such a nice sunny day to hear about Brexit. In the UK, there's almost a lack of enthusiasm now because Brexit is being discussed so much. So thank you for being here, and we'll try and inform as much as we can. So it's a great question, and I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is the shock of this decision. So clearly around the whole world there was a shock, and certainly in the UK there was a great shock about this result. Either side of the decision, however you felt about the Brexit scenario, I don't think anybody really expected it to happen. And on the 23rd, or really the morning of the 24th, when it became apparent that the UK had voted to leave the European Union, I think particularly amongst young people, and we know that 75% of the young people under the age of 25, wanted to remain in the European Union. So there's a great deal of shock that we initially have to deal with, and we're still going through that process. Some of you may be aware of the repercussions, and we'll touch on this later from a political point of view, and there was a petition which was signed by 4.1 million people in the UK to have a second referendum. They didn't like the results of the first one. It's a bit like I guess the denial phase of the grief cycle, if you want to think about it that way. That was of course rejected, and I have to say, and I will try and be as objective as possible, but I have to say I think that was the right decision to reject that proposal for a second referendum. Democracy and free speech are two things that I think are extremely important for the United Kingdom, and the notion of free speech and democracy is that once a decision has been made, that it has been made. And the key, going back to the question that you asked, our challenge now is to really bring some objectivity to this process. There's been a lot of misinformation on both sides. There's been a lot of hype in the media. And of course it provoked an extreme reaction. But we have to now get to the end of that grief cycle very quickly, that we are leaving the European Union, or at least we think we are. We'll come on to that a little bit later. But assuming we are leaving the European Union, this shouldn't be seen, certainly amongst young people, as just an Armageddon, a disaster. It's an opportunity too, and we have to now look at those opportunities. And one of the key things, unfortunately, we are going to keep saying today is we don't know, because we don't know what is going to happen. We can talk about the different scenarios that we might face, but we don't know exactly what will happen. But what we do know is that things will never be the same in the UK again. And we have to prepare our young people, our students, certainly in my business school, for embracing that change that's going to come. And already you've seen in the last week, the political landscape of the UK has changed beyond comprehension. We now have a new Prime Minister, as of yesterday. A second female Prime Minister yet. The opposition has changed. We effectively don't really have an opposition party in the UK at the moment. Things are changing very, very quickly. And what we need to do now is to work with our students to actually look at the opportunities that might arise in some of the scenarios that could come up. So I'll hand over to Ben in a second to continue this, but I think one thing which we're clearly going to discuss today is the fact that Ben and I were on different sides of the fence, I guess. So I wanted to remain in the EU. Ben felt very differently about that. But I think both of us appreciate that even if we had stayed in the EU, this is an opportunity as much as it is a change. And What I want to do today with you, and Ben also, is just to look at some of the scenarios that could now happen, and how that could have an impact on the future. So we will look at employment, we will touch on immigration, we will certainly look at the economy. I think the general message through the media is that from an economic point of view, Brexit isn't a good thing. Well, that may be the case, but there are arguments that might suggest that actually Brexit is an opportunity as well, and certainly the devaluation of the pound in the short term is probably a good thing for the UK. So our role, I think, is to inform and to keep objective and to avoid hysteria or panic about the future, because it will be okay. From a personal point of view, I was shocked, but we must move on, and we must now look at what opportunities this brings. And looking beyond the rest of the world outside of the EU, there are all sorts of opportunities that we should look at as well. So I'll hand over to Ben just to elaborate on that.
Afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to add my thank you to all of you for turning up for this debate, particularly the British contingent, who it might be thought would have had enough of this conversation by now. My wife was walking along a London street last week, and her colleague turned around to her and started talking about Brexit. And my wife said, "Oh, you're not going to start going on about Europe, are you?" And a random passerby turned around and said, "Well said." That's very much the attitude of the UK at the moment. I think my view, I mean, my background is the law. I teach contract law. And the fascinating thing for me is the legal changes that will arise out of this decision. It doesn't mean that now. It may not mean that for the next 5 years. And of course, it's not just, we have various subjects in the law. We have contract law, we have constitutional law, we have the law of the European Union. But that's misleading, really, because being a part of that club meant that a huge amount of legislation in all sorts of areas was effectively EU law as well. So it wasn't just that one box. So how we extricate ourselves from that framework, retaining what works and what is good, and jettisoning that which doesn't quite work, is going to be the question which occupies my students' time for the next 3 or 4 years, probably. Ricardo, does that answer your question?
Well, very well.
Okay, so what I thought that we would do in this session is we're going to talk a little bit about the context of the European Union. I'm aware that we've got a hugely diverse international audience with us, and not everybody is as fascinated with the minutiae of the European Union as perhaps Will and I are, and won't necessarily know all the background. So we're going to introduce the EU first of all, how it came to be, what the idea was behind its creation. We're then going to talk about the background to the referendum and why we had this huge national debate on membership. We'll then talk about the arguments, as well as reminded you, I was on the winning side, the leave side, Will was on the losing side. I'm going to try not to gloat, but it's going to be a stretch, I'm afraid. But we'll put those arguments forward as best we can. One of the depressing features about the way that the debate panned out in the UK was there was a hysterical tone to it, from both the Leave camp and from the Remain camp. And what we will try and do, with the kind of calm of reflection, is try and put all that into perspective and sort the lies from the truth. We'll then talk about what the decision means in terms of the political fallout, first of all, which I will talk chiefly on, and will then major on the economic consequences and the future. Okay, so does that sound okay for an outline? Okay, so in terms of the creation of the European Union, we have to go back to that post-war world. Ricardo set the scene nicely, because the EU was the creation of an internationalist perspective, the rejection in mainland Europe of nationalism, because in places like Germany we saw where that could lead, in favour of international collaboration. Britain was always an outlier on that, even from the very beginning, because Britain was in a very different place from France and Germany after the Second World War, and nationalism didn't quite have that taint of evil, if you like, which it did in mainland Europe. So it always had a slightly different relationship. It was Winston Churchill who first called for something like a United States of Europe. Churchill, of course, half English, half American, and he saw a continent uniting on the same model as the American model. What everybody forgets is it's not entirely clear whether Churchill saw Britain as a member of that community. A lot of people think Churchill saw Britain as a kind of bridge between the old world and the new, between Europe and America. So originally we stayed out when the European Cold and Steel Community, which was the precursor of the modern European Union, was created in 1957. Britain stayed out because it chose to stay out. Then in the 1960s we had second thoughts and we decided that we wanted to join. But at that time France was led by somebody called General de Gaulle, who I gather from Ricardo wasn't a great fan of Brazil, but he certainly was an even worse fan of the UK. And de Gaulle basically said no. And he said no 2 or 3 times when Britain applied to join what was then the EEC, the European Economic Community. Then in 1975, we had our first referendum on the subject, gluttons for punishment on referendums. And the British government put to the British people whether or not they wanted to join the European Economic Community. And the fascinating thing about that referendum, when we come to the politics of all this later, is what side everybody was on. In those days, the left was fundamentally anti the EEC, and it was the right that was pro the EEC. Now that's completely reversed nowadays. In those days, the EEC was seen as a capitalist club. People talked about the gnomes of Zurich running the political economies of Europe. Well, of course, Switzerland is not a member of the EEC. But the left was fundamentally suspicious of what membership would mean for workers' rights, for old-fashioned Keynesian economics and demand stimulus economics, and all that kind of thing. And there was also a big argument from the left on democracy. A very famous British politician called Anthony Wedgwood Benn complained that Britain, by membership of NATO, has sacrificed or foregone the power of the sword, and with membership of the EEC, we were about to give up the power of the purse. Okay? The right, on the other hand, thought the EEC was great. It looked at 1970s Britain, which was a very grim place indeed. We had 4-day weeks, we had strikes as a commonplace, we had inflation which was getting out of control, and we looked across at the economic miracle which was West Germany, and we effectively thought we would like some of that. So the country decided, by a not dissimilar margin that we've just had in the recent referendum, to join the EEC. Since then, it's become far more than just a trading bloc, as was originally envisaged. Hence, it's morphed into this European Union. And you've seen a series of treaties which have brought about those changes. Classic example, and again, everybody forgets it now in the UK, being the 1986 Single European Act, which effectively kick-started the creation of the single market. And it will surprise lots of people familiar with the British debate to learn that the key figure in pushing that act was Margaret Thatcher, who became the arch Eurosceptic. And again, the left was opposed to it. Fast forward 20, 30 years, and we come to the current referendum. Why did we have that referendum? We had it because the leader of the British Conservative Party, the British Right, was in a political jam. He was in a difficulty. His difficulty was that a party called the United Kingdom Independence Party was gaining ground, usually known as a right-wing party, but it's slightly more complicated than that. And also a fraction of the Conservative Party was very much against Europe. So he thought a clever ruse would be to call for a referendum. Nobody thought that the Leave side would win that referendum. I didn't think that we would win. David Cameron certainly didn't think we would win. The entire British elite didn't think we'd win. Hence, when Ricardo asked, what are the plans? The brutal answer is there weren't any. There were literally no plans for this to happen. And indeed, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, forbade the civil service from making any plans because he thought that it would encourage the Brexit campaign. So literally, we had nothing last week. Hence this grief. I always think that's a great first world problem term to describe Brexit, but grief about the rejection. Hence the British elite's complete refusal to believe that it's happening. That demand for a second referendum that Will talked about was an incredibly vociferous demand in the UK. There was a letter recently signed on Monday by, I think it was 100 or 50 lawyers complaining about the result and saying the referendum shouldn't be legally binding. I have to say, if there's one way of making Brexit popular. It's for lawyers to be demonstrating against it, but that's a separate question. So that's where we were with the referendum. In terms of that debate, I promised you a measured, careful summary of the arguments of the Leave camp before Will delivers an equally measured summary of the arguments of the Remain camp. Essentially, there were three, as far as I can see. The main argument was about democracy. And I was pilloried by left-wing friends of mine for talking about democracy. They said this is just some abstract noun. What does it actually mean? Surely it means more that my mobile phone coverage is going to cost more if we come out of the single market. Surely it means more that the FTSE might fall. My argument would be that if necessary, I would be prepared for my children to eat nothing but grass for the next 3 years if it meant we got control of our democratic institutions back. Even proponents of the EU would struggle to explain the workings of the EU. Between the Commission, between the Parliament. The European Parliament is a classic example. The Parliament has no power to initiate legislation. That's an extraordinary thing. Elections for members of the European Parliament in the UK have an abysmally low turnout, about 30%. That's because everybody knows that these guys have no power. Although they're paid better than members of the British Parliament and enjoy privileges that go with that position. So for me, it's fundamentally important that there is democracy, that there is transparency about how we are governed. The second arguments were based around the economy. Ricardo has presented a fairly bleak picture for post-Brexit Britain, but I would argue that it's just too early to tell how bleak that picture really will be. The pound was always going to fall with the short-term uncertainty in the political situation because the markets don't like uncertainty. I gather it's gone back up slightly, as has the FTSE, with the appointment of the next Prime Minister, with that return of stability. I would argue that the free trade possibilities open to us will be far greater than our future would have been in the EU. We are a net importer of EU goods. I doubt very much whether or not the EU is going to erect the kind of tariff barriers that the doomsayers are saying they will. I just don't think they can afford to. People talk about trade deals, but the EU doesn't have a trade deal with China. It doesn't have a trade deal with America. They're negotiating one at the moment with America called the TTIP. The French have just said that's very unlikely to come out this year because there's huge opposition in France. So I would argue that we've got a pretty good chance of making those deals work on our own. But there's a third argument as well, and it's an argument that it's incredibly difficult to talk about in the UK, and that's immigration. If you talk about immigration in the UK, particularly if you say that it should be restricted, you are immediately branded a racist. I find that fundamentally repellent. I'm married to an immigrant. My children are half Indian. I don't have a racist bone in my body. And yet, I can sympathise with people, particularly on low incomes and in low-skilled jobs, who've been priced out of those jobs by cheaper European labour. I can see where they're coming from. It's no surprise to me that middle-class people in the UK don't necessarily regard this as a strong argument, because newspapers don't hire cheap labour from Poland to write their columns. Okay? Lawyers tend not to be threatened by immigration. They'd be more threatened with a points-based system. And it's no surprise when you talked about young people, graduates in a points-based immigration system would find things very difficult. So I can sympathise with where people were coming from at the lower end of the scale economically on this. I do think immigration is a good thing, but I think controlled immigration, which is targeted, is a better thing. And I'm not sure that we could do that within the EU. So that's my summary of the Leave campaign. I will hand over to Will to rebut all of those arguments.
So it feels a little, perhaps in bad faith, to present the arguments for an argument that we effectively lost. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the Remain arguments, but just a summary. The main argument for staying in the EU were primarily economic, and we will explore the economic consequences of this decision a little bit later on. With the Remain hat on and just the main arguments for staying in the EU, the key one was strength. and size and negotiation power. So the EU, you're probably aware, is the second largest economy in the world, just behind the States. And that may not stay the same forever, but in terms of its global negotiating power, the Remain argument was that we would be in a far better position to negotiate trade deals with China, for example, Brazil perhaps, as part of this economic superpower. I certainly don't think anyone who was pro-Remain, or Remain as we call it in the UK, there's now Brexit, by the way, which is just regret. Anyway, that's a UK thing. But there certainly wasn't a feeling that the EU was perfect. I think everybody accepts that the EU is not perfect, that there are deep-rooted problems with the EU. But from a Remain perspective, it was about staying in the EU, being part of the solution rather than running away from it. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the Remain argument because we're not going to stay in the EU. So let me just give a bit more of a perspective around why I think the Leave campaign was successful. And I think what Ben said was absolutely right. Some of the, and even speaking to some of you guys in the audience today about your experience on social media after the results, just the sheer anger and some outrageous insults that were hurled at people who wanted to leave the EU, which is quite wrong. For me, I think there were two types of leavers, two main ones. Those of you who might be familiar with Nicholas Nassim Taleb, Daniel Kahneman, if you're not familiar with them, they've written a number of very important books. Nicholas Nassim Taleb wrote The Black Swan, which I'd highly recommend to any of you. And Daniel Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, which is one of my personally favourite books of all time. And they have a similar philosophy, not an identical philosophy, but a similar one around rationality and decision making. And Kahneman in particular talks about a fallacy, and particularly a narrative fallacy. And in the UK, there are issues, certainly outside of London, where most people voted to leave the EU. There are deep-rooted issues with this current government and how things have worked out. And there is a general perception in the UK that Londoners have it better than the rest of the country. And whilst London's prospered under this government, other parts of the UK have really suffered. Now, going back to this narrative fallacy, this is the idea of simplifying a complex problem. And the problems in the UK are complex. And the idea of the narrative fallacy is putting a story to explain all of that. So basically glossing over a real complex set of issues and trying to explain it away. And I think that's really where the Leave campaign was successful with part of that population. So a lot of the UK problems could be solved by leaving the EU. Of course, we know now that there wasn't really a plan for if we left the EU. But I think a lot of voters in the UK felt that it was time for a change, and leaving the EU was an opportunity to do that. Now, that's one group, but then you have your second group, and Ben very much falls into this category of voter who were very well informed and were very pro-immigration, but much more progressive, and saw this as an opportunity to really change things from an economic point of view. And that, for me, is the big question now. Are things actually going to change? So we'll talk a little bit further about some scenarios, but just to give you an overview of what might happen. One possible scenario here is that we don't actually end up leaving the EU. That is a possibility. And the reason why that might happen is because we have a new Prime Minister, and depending on how long that decision is delayed about invoking Article 50, so the UK has to invoke an article in the EU treaty to actually trigger this release from the EU. And that process will take 2 years. It's not been triggered yet. Cameron, as you know, certainly didn't invoke it the day after the referendum results. So there's a big question now about when will that actually happen. And one possible scenario is that it's delayed and delayed until an election happens, a general election. And I think Ben's going to talk a little bit more in a minute or two about the political consequences of what's happened. But it's not inconceivable that one of the main political parties in the UK may, very much as their manifesto, argue to stay within the EU, to not effectively trigger Article 50. And if that happens, it would be fascinating, I think, to see the outcome of that election, because that could potentially stop this from happening. Now, that's only one scenario. I'm sure Ben will have some thoughts on how likely that is, but that is one option we must consider, that things don't actually change, we do remain within the EU. At this stage, I think it's fairly small, but I'll let Ben answer that. The next scenario is that we leave the EU, and then we have an arrangement similar to Norway, or slightly further away from that to Switzerland. And that would be where we effectively remain within the economic area of Europe. So free trades and then free movement of people remains as part of that. And things would be different in that situation, but not nearly as much as some of the fears raised by the Remain campaign. The other scenario is that we go down the World Trade Organization route, where we do sever freedom of trade and freedom of movement ties with the EU, and we effectively become an island, a real true economic island. And for me, that's quite an interesting one to explore, because there are real opportunities there in terms of what we can do with the rest of the world. And one scenario is that we look at removing tariffs altogether. Now, going back to the very first question about the impact on young people, on students, that could have huge ramifications. The very structure of the UK would change. So I guess that's a summary of where the Remain thinking was, but obviously we're not there, and now we need to look at each of those scenarios and the impact it would have from an economic and business point of view. Just one point before I forget, there was one company whose share price didn't fall. In fact, it went up in the FTSE 100 in the UK when the referendum result came through. Does anyone know which company that might be? Any ideas? It was Pearson, our company. And amazing really, every other company's share price fell dramatically, as we know. And as Ben quite rightly said, that recovery is starting to come through now. But Pearson's share price actually went up. And it goes back to the key concern from a business point of view about this decision. And it's uncertainty. And it's something we now need to deal with more than ever. So investors, the business world, does not like uncertainty. The reason why Pearson's share price went up is because a large part of Pearson's revenue comes from the US, the United States. So we have huge reserves in dollars. Our reliance on the UK economy is not huge. So very interesting to see that reaction. And again, if you looked at the price of precious metals, they instantly shot up because again, it was a stable investment option in that short term. So I'll go back to Ben, who's going to talk more about the political side of this result.
So I had asked Ricardo to provide some dueling pistols so that we could settle this the old-fashioned way, but they don't appear to be here, so we shall continue. In terms of the political fallout, Will's analysis was spot on. And of course, exactly what that fallout will be depends partly on which one of those scenarios that Will talked about manifests itself. The fascinating thing, though, is how much the political kaleidoscope in the UK has been shaken up. I can't remember a time when your political signalling was based so completely around one single issue. So, for example, in the UK over the last week, we've seen a dating app launched for Remainers, so that you can go on a date with someone you don't know, in the certainty that you won't be exposed to any horrible Leave propaganda. It's extraordinary stuff. And it comes from this realignment. Remember I said at the start that the left started out very much anti the EU, or the EEC as it then was, and the right started off pro. What's prompted that shift? In the UK, it's become seen as the progressive thing to do to want to stay in the European Union. As it's morphed more into a social political club as opposed to an economic club, more of the agenda of the EU has become aligned with the left rather than the right. So a lot of regulation, a lot of workers' rights, for example, have been underpinned and undergirded by EU regulation. So the left has kind of been converted to the EU at the same time that the right has fallen out of love with it, pretty much for the same reasons. What's fascinating about the political scene at the moment in Britain is that the party of the left is the Labour Party. Its elites, with the possible exception of its current leader, are unequivocal about wanting to stay in the EU. But its voters all voted, or not all, but a large majority of its voters voted to leave. So on election night, on referendum night, I stayed up to watch the results because I'm very sad and have no social life. And the results from places like Sunderland and in the north of England, Birmingham in the middle of England, the old industrial heartlands, the old industrial base, they were all voting to leave. As Ricardo says, London was completely different, but London was the only region of England to vote to remain in the UK. So there is this disconnect between effectively the working classes, if I can use that kind of term, and the elites of the Labour Party, which it's hard to see resolving in any other way than a split in the Labour Party. Now that's happened before. It happened in 1981 with the formation of the Social Democratic Party. That didn't work because of Britain's voting system, which is heavily biased in favour of two main single parties that we have today. But whether or not that will work next time is, I think, open to question. So there's a very real possibility of a fracturing of the left. But equally there's a possibility of a fracturing of the right. If, as Will says, we don't leave the EU, if Article 50 isn't triggered, then Theresa May, our new Prime Minister, is going to have a very, very uncomfortable time. If that majority vote is ignored and the elites win in the face of that vote, then there will be all hell to pay. All those people who voted leave will feel incredibly frustrated with the existing political parties. And what I worry about is that that will push people into the extremes. UKIP, that I mentioned before, which is a fairly right-wing party, what the Labour Party could become if the Social Democrat moderates split off for it, might mean some very bumpy times. And in terms of the impact on business then, you can imagine what that's going to look like, or we'll talk a little bit more about it. So in terms of the UK political scene, in terms of the makeup of our parties, it's huge. But in terms of the makeup of Britain itself, and then potentially Europe, it's equally huge. Scotland, as Ricardo said, voted heavily to remain in the EU. Scotland had a referendum a couple of years ago on whether or not it should leave the UK. They voted to stay in the UK. But one of the reasons for that was, it was argued by advocates of the Union that in order to remain in the EU, Scotland would have to stay in the United Kingdom. So that's fundamentally shifted around. Will Scotland go? It might, but then there's big question marks over that. Scotland's economy is heavily oil-based. The oil price, as you know, has crashed over the last 12 months. Had Scotland gone independent with that situation, they would have been in real difficulties. If they join the EU, it's very unlikely that they'll get an opt-out of the euro. If you look at Greece, there's a very real possibility that Scotland could end up with, like Greece, but with worse weather, which would be a very bad thing for the Scots. Northern Ireland, what will happen? It's possible that Northern Ireland could leave, but I think that's less likely. Northern Ireland is not an economically prosperous place. It doesn't even have the North Sea oil that Scotland has. There's whole issues, as I'm sure you know, about potentially joining up with Southern Ireland, which I think is, again, very unlikely. So I think that Ireland will probably stay. The Welsh are our best football team in the UK at the moment, somewhat depressingly and embarrassingly. Of course, they voted with England to stay, so there'll be no change there. That, I think, is the political fallout. Will, do you want to talk about the economic?
So, let's start with the short term. it's no secret that the value of sterling has fallen significantly in the last couple of weeks. It's recovered slightly since Tuesday. I'm losing the days. We're on Tuesday today, aren't we? So it was yesterday, sorry. A little bit checked up there. So yesterday when the new Prime Minister was announced, and since then there has been an improvement in the sterling rate. Not a dramatic one, and I think probably a short-term improvement as well. So if you are wanting to swap your pounds for other currencies, today's probably the best day. We'll see. Don't come complain if that's not true. What does that mean? What does that mean? In the very short term, it's a good thing. From an export point of view, our exports become cheaper. That's good for trade. We have in the UK a balance of payments deficit. We import a lot more than we export, and that's been a problem for a long time now. So as Ben said earlier, a devaluation needed to happen irrespective of this Brexit decision. If we start to look longer term, then we need to consider things like investment. And one of the key concerns about the longer term impacts of this decision is the amount of investment actually in the UK. Investment in the UK from a jobs perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, is a good thing. It's not always a good thing, but from an economic point of view, having investment coming into the UK stimulates economic activity. The key concern, and I'm going to try not to be too gloomy about prospects in the UK, because I don't think it's all doom and gloom, but the key issue at the moment is this uncertainty. And until we do know what's going to happen, until we have a better idea about when Article 50 will be triggered, there is going to be a lot of companies holding back on investment in the UK. I think Ireland and Dublin and Stuttgart in particular are going to be the big winners from the financial point of view. And again, this completely depends on what happens on the political landscape. But some of you may be aware about the strength of the financial services sector in the UK. It is very London focused, but it is one of the powerhouses of the UK economy. And one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons why it's been such an attractive place for financial institutions, partly because corporation tax rates have generally been quite favourable, and they're improving even more now. And I'll come back to that in just a second. But in terms of the real reason for financial institutions wanting to be based in London, it enabled passporting, and passporting enables an institution based in the UK to effectively trade anywhere within the EU, so to conduct financial transactions and offer financial services such as insurance from their London base to the rest of the EU. Now, that's the real danger for London-based financial institutions. Will we lose the right to passporting? And if so, I think what you'd find very quickly is that a number of the big banks, particularly the American banks who have always used London to access the EU through this passporting system, you may find that they do relocate very quickly to Dublin or Frankfurt. So that would be interesting to see. So are we going to go into recession in the UK? It's possible, and I think the longer this uncertainty continues, then the less investment will happen. There will be inflation very quickly. We're already starting to see it. My mobile phone, my cell phone, is up for renewal, so I can get a new cell phone. And the price plans already from international providers who provide services and phones to the UK, those prices are going up already. So in the UK, my mobile phone, my cell phone, will be more expensive than it was just a few weeks ago. And we will see this inflation come in, combined with uncertainty, combined with the lack of investment and therefore less opportunities for jobs. I do think in the shorter term, certainly until this uncertainty is resolved, we may well fall into recession. I attended a briefing by Ernst & Young, the professional services body, last week, and that their view was quite pessimistic, I have to say, for the short term. Now, in terms of the wider economy then, in terms of the global economy, it is going to have an impact more directly on the EU. The UK is a big trading partner of the EU, and if we fall into recession, then that has an impact on economic activity in the rest of the EU, and of course then we can look more globally. So for me, the key thing, the thing that has to happen now is clarity as soon as possible. Although I guess in a dream situation we wouldn't leave the EU. I mean, I never wanted it to happen, but here we are. I'll be just as happy if Theresa May triggers Article 50 tomorrow and came out with a plan of what would happen. There are of course the negotiations with the EU about Brexit and how that's going to happen, and that's going to be very interesting too from a political situation. As Juncker said a couple of days after the referendum results, it's not an amicable divorce. You know, if you think about unrest in other European countries, in France in particular, the EU are not going to want to facilitate an easy situation for the UK where they can leave the European Union but still retain a lot of the benefits of being within the European Union. So I think it's going to be quite fascinating for the next few months and years to see how those negotiations are carried out. And going back to the opportunity now, in the short term, I think a whole industry will be created around Brexit in the UK. I really do. From a legal perspective, from a financial perspective, there's a big opportunity for a lot of companies to be part of this negotiation. And that is a short-term opportunity in the UK. Just going back to a more positive impact, and let's say we do leave the EU and we decide to completely leave the European Economic Area, which is a very real prospect, then I think one of the more exciting scenarios there is where we do abolish, or try to abolish, tariffs with other countries. So with the US, for example, straight away, the biggest export market for the UK is the US, and that could actually stimulate a lot of export growth, particularly with our devalued currency. And then you think about China and South America and all the huge opportunities there are in this region. And quite quickly it becomes a really, really interesting scenario where we do abolish tariffs altogether. From a wider business perspective, how will the employment situation change? I think migration is a really interesting area. If we stay economically tied to the European Economic Area, then it's very, very likely that the free movement of people will also stay as part of that relationship. And therefore there will still be opportunities for young people to travel, to work as you can do now. So it certainly isn't all doom and gloom. We're not going to be in a situation where you can't go and work in France or you can't go and study in Germany. That I just do not think will happen. But the reality is that there is an issue around migration in the UK, and the political impact of that in terms of the UK's migration policy, immigration policy specifically, is going to be really interesting. And I sincerely hope that it will become easier rather than harder for people to come and work in the UK, because our economy, like most of the EU economies, is reliant on immigrants. We have skill shortages in a lot of areas. In London there's a huge tech startup community, one of the biggest in the world, but there is a skill shortage in the UK. We don't have enough scientists, enough computer scientists. And whilst we have that skill shortage, we must keep relying on immigration to come in and to plug that gap and to grow that opportunity. So, above everything else, I hope very much from an economic and from a workforce perspective that migration actually becomes easier in the UK rather than harder. And that's the hope. The only other thing I'll just say very quickly is workers' rights, because a lot of what happens in the UK is based on EU directives, and a lot of the laws that happen in the UK are based around EU directives too. So in the UK, for example, you must have at least 20 days of holiday per year. Is anyone from the US? Yeah, of course we do. We have Louisiana, don't we? So what's the average number of holidays, vacation days in the US? About 14 days, yeah. Which as a Brit sounds horrendous. I really enjoy my holiday. And it is conceivable that things will start to move more to that American model where the amount of days of annual leave and workers' rights in that area start to change. Now, I guess that's more a theoretical argument, because in reality, if you're a worker, and again, talent acquisition is a huge area of concern for a lot of companies, attracting the right talent, people who have the right skills in this contemporary workforce, particularly in the UK, means that you do need to really stand out amongst other employers. And if we do move towards a situation where vacation days are dropping, for example, then the reality is it won't happen. Young people will not want to go and work for these companies. So things will change, but I don't think the work environment will change dramatically, certainly not in the next 5 to 10 years. Longer term, as a new generation, a post-Brexit generation, I believe MTV are now calling the post-millennial generation founders. So let's call them that for now. As they come through this post-Brexit generation, where they've never experienced a professional or a higher education life outside of or within the EU, then you may see working conditions starting to change more dramatically. It's a very interesting time. It's certainly, on a political and economic scale, the biggest thing that's happening in our lifetimes. And we really don't know what's going to happen. What I would urge and what I would advise above everything else is confirmation. So we need stability, we need to know the plan. And the quicker that happens, the better the impact, I think. But Brexit is not all doom and gloom, and I will stop talking now. But Brexit is an opportunity as much as it is a shock, and as much as it is something that we know 48% of the population didn't want to happen. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is a big opportunity here, and now we must work to actually develop this new landscape and this new outcome, because it could potentially be as exciting as fearful. So with that, I think we'll stop talking.
All right. Well, congratulations, first of all. Please, another round of applause for these brave guys that try to unlock the secrets of Brexit for us. Well, we'll have now our Q&A session, starting by the questions that were sent in anticipation by you that are following this panel about the Brexit through our channel in internet. And then after that we will open for the questions for people who are here in the auditorium. So if you want to make your question, your contribution to this debate, please be ready. We'll be in a few minutes waiting, asking for you to come up here. I will be asking you to use the mic so we can record and webcast this, okay? We have, as I told you, several questions. They are real interest in this topic. Some of them I was trying to. Erika Claudia Escalante, thank you for sending your question. She's asking, what will be the impact of Brexit on Latin American and South American countries in your point of view, please?
Great question. So, I think, again, I'm going to keep saying this, unfortunately, it depends. But if we go to a scenario where we are outside of the EU, which is the likely outcome, then we do have an opportunity to negotiate trades and opportunities with countries without the hindrance, I suppose, of the European Union. And up until now, the European Union has negotiated on behalf of Britain. So I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly for a lot of Latin American countries. If we look at the skill shortages in the UK, if we look at working practices and what we can learn from Latin America, I think that there are lots of scenarios where the amount of trade with countries like Brazil, Peru, other countries could increase quite dramatically. There's an issue, I guess, as well around standards. So again, everything that comes into the UK fits in with EU standards, and it will be fascinating to see whether we develop our own set of standards, and again working with a wider set of countries than perhaps we have done until now. So I think there are lots of opportunities, and the one thing I think really we have to say to emphasise is Britain is open for business. I firmly believe that. Yes, there is a section of the population who want to vote for change and are not happy with the situation in the UK, but I don't really believe that people want to stop growing and collaborating with the rest of the world, and I think now there is in some ways more of an opportunity to do that.
Would you like to add something, or let's wait for the following questions? All right. So, Ms. Erika, thank you very much for sending your question from Peru. And the next question I'd like to address for you both guys, please, comes also from Peru. Xian Lin Orlando Diaz asks, she goes, I'm sorry, directly to the point. What are the most significant impacts on management due to the Brexit?
I think, and again, one could say it depends. We'll have to wait and see for quite a lot of these. But my hunch is that it is business as usual. But one of the main changes is going to be potentially in the regulatory environment under which business operates. A huge amount of regulation comes out of Brussels, whether you're a Remainer or Leaver, it's an undeniable fact. And what happens to that legal regulatory landscape during our extrication from the European Union is going to be extremely interesting. As Will said earlier, there could be impacts on working conditions, for example. Managing that, managing employment rights in that evolving context of potential uncertainty is going to be a huge challenge, but we'll have to see. The devil will be in the detail as to how it pans out. Will, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I was going to say is the challenge of a lot of global corporations in attracting talent. It's an issue for us. It's an issue for me, for our business. How do we attract good people? Why do good people want to come and work for Pearson? And I think that actually convincing people to come and work in the UK, perhaps at least in the short term, has become harder now. And I think there's a challenge for UK organisations to try and attract and keep the best talent in the UK, and certainly to attract talent from other parts of the world. At the same time, I think there's a real opportunity for young people in the UK to actually work in other parts of the world as well. I really can't see a situation where opportunities outside of the UK will fall as a result of this. I think if anything, more opportunities will arise. So for me, I think talent management is the key issue now.
Thank you, professors. Thank you, Miss or Mr. I'm really sorry, Xianlin Orlando from Peru. Before going ahead here, let me say in first hand that we are thinking of creating a new IBS program back in London, and perhaps it would be a good opportunity for you all have the chance of going there, learn from this exciting historic moment we are living today, right? The third question comes from Ethiopia. Fentahun Admasu Yaye sent the question about the real economic, social and political benefits of Britain from the exit of the United European Union. Well, I believe you have already talked about this, but if you could summarize what do you expect as a good output of this process, please?
I guess the word I'd use to start with is freedom. That Britain effectively has got back the right to make its own laws. Whilst we were a member of the EU, European law was sovereign over UK law. That's like Brazil deciding to become a member of an international club based in Chile and abiding by the decisions of that extra supranational body. Now we have our freedom back. I hope we use that freedom properly and responsibly to retain what was best in EU regulation, to get rid of that which didn't quite work. But I'd hope for far more engagement in that process now that we have control back. I guess also I would say, one thing I agree with Will about is that while we were in the European Union, it was very easy to blame all the ills of the country on the EU. And the right certainly tended to do that. That excuse will no longer be there, and we'll have to shine a light on our own social problems, our own problems with inequality and the rest of it, and work out how to solve those problems, knowing that there's nobody else to blame anymore.
Thank you. And the last question that I will read before opening for the auditorium making their questions comes from from Liberia. What would be the impact over the EU, the European Union economy about the Brexit on your perspective? Is the European Union be affected somehow?
Arguably, and another great question by the way, arguably the EU will be more affected by this than Britain. A lot of trade goes both ways between the EU and the UK, and it will be fascinating to see how other EU countries react to this. There is, and Ben mentioned it earlier, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which has just been postponed, but is due to come into effect next year between the EU and the USA. Now, it's quite a controversial bill in itself, but the general nature of the agreement is free trade between the United States and the European Union. And I guess that's possibly more in doubt now as a result of this decision. If it goes through, then from a trade perspective, and there are a lot of factors to consider with that agreement, from a trade perspective it should facilitate more trade between the US and the EU, which from an economic perspective should be a good thing. But actually whether it goes ahead and happens, I think has been thrown into doubt by this decision that's been made. So again, I keep saying this, I'm sorry, we don't know, but I think in the short term it might be negative, but in the longer term the EU will recover. The EU can certainly function without the UK.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Bolger, for sending your question. And now we are ending the webcast of this session. Thank you for watching this panel about the Brexit through our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Great guy for trying to unlock the secrets of Brexit for us. Well.